Nobody is coming to save you, he said it with a smile. Standing in the middle of her grandmother's cafe surrounded by broken glass and shattered picture frames, Caleb Voss looked at Madison Walker like she was already dead. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked at the photograph still in her hand, her grandmother's face cracked down the middle where the frame had hit the floor, and she made a decision. If you've ever been told you don't matter, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all broke open started the same way every morning. In Ridgecrest, Colorado, started with the smell of dark roast coffee drifting down the main street before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Madison Walker had been awake since 4:30, same as always. She tied her apron behind her back, pulled her blonde hair up out of her face, and started the first pot of the day before a single customer had walked through the door. She was 28 years old, and she had been doing this since she was 22. And some mornings, the quiet ones, the ones before the noise started, she felt like the luckiest person alive. Golden Willow Cafe wasn't much to look at from the outside. The sign above the door was painted by hand, slightly uneven. The letters done in green and gold, the summer after her grandmother died. The tables inside were mismatched. The chairs had seen better decades. The coffee machine behind the counter was old enough that most professional baristas would have laughed at it. But that machine made the best cup of coffee in the entire county, and everyone in Ridgecrest knew it. Madison knew the names of her customers the way other people knew song lyrics automatically without thinking from deep memory. She knew that Earl Hutchins, the retired miner, took his coffee, black and his eggs scrambled soft, and that he would sit at the table closest to the window because his knees ached in the cold and the morning sun helped. She knew that Dorothy Vance came in every Tuesday and Thursday at 8:15, ordered chamomile tea even though it wasn't really a cafe drink, and then spent 40 minutes telling Madison about her garden. She knew that the group of high school teachers from the school 3 blocks over always came in loud on Friday mornings, filling the corner booth laughing too hard, leaving generous tips because they remembered what it was like to need them. This was what the cafe was. It was not a business plan. It was not an investment strategy. It was a place where people showed up because someone was always there waiting to see them. Her grandmother, Ruth Walker, had built that from nothing. Ruth had come to Ridgecrest with $6 a recipe for apple pie, and the kind of stubbornness that people in Colorado mountains tend to develop when the wind gets cold enough. She had built the cafe with her own money, her own labor, and a belief deeply held, never wavered from that. The most important thing a person could do was make another person feel like they belonged somewhere. When Ruth died 6 years ago, she left the cafe to Madison. Not to Madison's father, not to any of her other relatives. To Madison. Because Ruth had seen something in her granddaughter that Madison herself hadn't fully understood yet. The will said simply, "She knows what this place is for." Madison had spent 6 years trying to prove her grandmother right, and for 6 years she had. The trouble with Caleb Voss was that he had been in Ridgecrest long enough for people to forget how he'd gotten his power. He'd arrived about 4 years ago, which in a town like this made him practically a newcomer, but he had the kind of personality that filled up a room whether you invited it or not. He wore expensive clothes that looked slightly wrong for the mountains too, tailored too clean, and he drove a truck that cost more than most people in town made in 2 years. He had a way of smiling at you that made you feel like he was measuring something, calculating something, and had already arrived at an answer he wasn't planning to share. He owned several businesses in town on paper, a property management company, a logistics firm with an office nobody ever seemed to use, a small bar on the edge of downtown that did steady business but never seemed to turn the kind of profit that would justify how well Caleb Voss lived. People in Ridgecrest weren't stupid. They understood privately in whispered conversations in parking lots and over back fences that Caleb Voss's money came from something other than legitimate enterprise. They understood that several business owners in town had started making weekly payments to a man who called it security consulting, and that the businesses which refused those payments had a way of running into problems. Broken windows, failed health inspections, vendors who suddenly stopped delivering, landlords who suddenly remembered clauses in leases that nobody had worried about before. They understood all of this, but understanding something and doing something about it are two different mountains to climb, and the people of Ridgecrest had chosen mostly to stay at the bottom of the second one. Madison had heard the whispers. She had even been warned gently by two other business owners she trusted. He's going to come to you eventually. One of them had told her, a man named Frank who ran the hardware store on 2nd Street. He comes to everyone eventually, just be careful how you handle it. Madison had thanked Frank for the warning, and then she had gone back to making coffee and not thinking about it because Golden Willow Cafe had survived 6 Colorado winters, 2 economic downturns, in a summer when a burst pipe flooded the kitchen. It had survived because Madison was careful with money, loyal to her customers, and because the community that Ruth Walker had built inside those walls kept showing up no matter what. She believed genuinely, not naively, but with the deep down certainty of someone who had learned it through experience, that if you treated people right, they would stand beside you when it mattered. She was right about that, but she was about to find out the hard way what it cost to get there. Caleb Voss came on a Tuesday. Madison was in the back when she heard the bell above the door, the small copper bell her grandmother had hung there in 1987. She heard it, and she heard the sudden shift in the noise of the room. Not silence exactly, but a flattening the way people get quiet when something enters the air that doesn't belong there. She came out from the back, wiping her hands on her apron, and found 3 men standing just inside the door. The 2 on the sides were large, the kind of large that comes from intention, from time spent making yourself into something that other people find physically discouraging. They stood with their arms at their sides and said nothing. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. The man in the middle was Caleb Voss. He looked around the cafe the way a person looks at something they're deciding whether to keep or throw away. Slow, deliberate, without any attempt to disguise what he was doing. Earl Hutchins, who had been sitting at his window table with his eggs and his newspaper, looked up. His eyes went to Caleb, then to Madison, then back to his plate. His hand, Madison noticed, had tightened around his coffee mug. Dorothy Vance set down her teacup very carefully. The 4 teachers in the corner booth had stopped talking entirely. "Nice place," Caleb said. He said it the way people say things they don't mean at all. Madison put both hands flat on the counter. "Thank you. What can I get you?" He smiled, that measuring smile. "I'm not here for coffee." "Then I'm not sure I can help you," Madison said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Steadier than she felt. He moved towards the counter, slowly looking at the photographs on the wall, as he went decades of Ridgecrest history, customers, and moments in ordinary life framed and hung by her grandmother's hands. He stopped in front of one. An old black and white photograph of Ruth Walker standing outside the cafe the day it opened, young and serious-faced and certain. "Your grandmother's place," he said. "My place," Madison said. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, not yet, just a reevaluation. "Right," he said, "your place. And you've worked hard to keep it. I respect that." "I'm glad," Madison said. "Is there something I can help you with?" He leaned against the counter. He didn't ask permission to lean against it. He just leaned. "I'm here because I look out for businesses in this town. I make sure nothing bad happens to them. Vandalism, break-ins, you know how it is. Things happen even in quiet mountain towns." "We haven't had any problems," Madison said. "That's great," he said. "That's really great. I'd love to help make sure it stays that way." The room was perfectly still. Madison could feel everyone listening. She could feel the weight of it, the way her customers were all holding themselves carefully, the way even Earl Hutchins, who had never been afraid of anything in 67 years of life, was sitting very still. "I don't need that kind of help," Madison said, "but thank you." The smile didn't leave his face. If anything, it got slightly wider. "You sure about that?" "Very sure." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up from the counter, tugged at the cuff of his jacket, and nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Think it over. I'll check back." He walked toward the door. The 2 men moved with him in that coordinated, practiced way that told Madison this was not the first time they'd done this. At the door, he stopped and turned back. "Great coffee smell, by the way," he said. "Would be a shame if anything happened to the machine." And then he left. The bell above the door rang, and the entire cafe let out a breath it had been holding. Earl Hutchins was the first one to speak. "Madison," he said slowly, carefully, "you understand who that was." "I know who he is," she said. "Then you understand Earl." She said his name gently but firmly. "Let me get you a fresh cup." He stared at her. Then he nodded once and let it go because he had known Madison Walker for 6 years, and he knew when she had made up her mind about something. But later, after the breakfast rush had cleared, after the cafe had emptied out into the quiet mid-morning lull, She stood behind the counter alone and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the counter to stop it. She had known he would come eventually. Frank had told her. Other people had told her. She had known the way you know things you don't want to think about, keeping them at the edge of your mind where they can't quite reach you. He had come, and she had said no. She understood what came next. She wasn't a child. She wasn't pretending the world worked differently than it did. But she also understood with a clarity that surprised her, that felt almost like calm, that if she paid him once, she would be paying him forever. And everything her grandmother had built, everything she had spent 6 years protecting, would no longer be hers. It would be his. He would own it without his name ever being on anything. Ruth Walker had built this place for people who needed somewhere to belong, and Madison was not going to hand it to a man like Caleb Voss. She took a breath, she picked up her cloth, she went back to wiping down the counter. He came back 4 days later. Not with a request this time, with a number. He sat down at the counter, actually sat this time on one of the stools like he was a regular, and he named a figure. Weekly, cash. He called it an operating arrangement. Madison looked at him. No, she said. His jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. That's not a smart answer. It's the only one I have. Madison. He said her name for the first time, and something about the way he said it, familiar, proprietary, like he already owned a small piece of her, made her stomach turn. I've been reasonable. I came here. I explained the situation. I gave you time to think. I'm trying to make this easy. Nothing about this is easy, she said. It can be. No, she said again. Not for me. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Neither of them moved. Then he stood up from the stool, buttoned his jacket, and said very quietly, I'll give you one more day to reconsider. You won't need to, she said. The answer won't change. He walked out. This time he didn't say anything at the door. That night, Madison sat in the empty cafe after closing at the table closest to the window where Earl always sat, and she looked out at the mountain street and felt for the first time truly afraid. Not afraid of him exactly. Afraid of what came after people like him stopped asking. She knew what came after. Everyone in Ridgecrest knew what came after. She sat with that fear for a long time. She let herself feel it because she believed in feeling things honestly the way her grandmother had taught her. Feel the fear. Know it. Then decide what you're going to do anyway. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. She went home. She did not sleep well. They came before opening. She was inside when she heard the sound. Not a knock, not even the bell, just an impact against the front door so hard it shuddered in its frame. And then the lock was no longer a barrier, and then they were inside. 3 men, different ones than before she would realize later, hired specifically for this. Caleb Voss himself was not with them. Of course he wasn't. That was how men like him operated. They arranged things from a distance and let someone else carry the reality of what they decided. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not a conversation, it was a message. They moved through the cafe with a systematic, deliberate brutality that was worse somehow than random rage would have been. Random rage was emotional. This was professional. This was calculated. They hit the coffee machine first, the old one, the one that had been there since Ruth Walker bought it secondhand 23 years ago, the one that Madison had learned to repair herself because replacement parts were nearly impossible to find. They hit it with something she didn't see exactly what, and it made a sound she would hear in her sleep for months. They swept the counter. Equipment hit the floor. The ceramic canisters her grandmother had painted by hand flour, sugar coffee, the letters in Ruth's careful cursive shattered. They went to the wall. The photographs. Madison had framed 43 photographs over the years. Her grandmother had framed 11 more before her. 54 photographs of Ridgecrest life, of ordinary people, of the unremarkable and beautiful and irreplaceable texture of a community. They hit the wall. Frames fell. Glass broke. Madison did not move. Later, she would not be able to explain with complete certainty why she didn't move, whether it was shock or something colder than shock. Some survival instinct that understood that moving meant escalating, and escalating meant something worse. She stood. She watched. She did not cry. She did not beg. One of the men looked at her and said with no particular emotion, "Boss says think it over." Then they left, and she was alone in it. The silence after they left was the worst part. Silence and the smell of coffee from the grounds that had spilled across the floor. The smell of the cafe, the smell that meant mourning and belonging, and people who cared about each other, mixed with broken glass and upended chairs in the ceramic dust of her grandmother's handwriting. She walked to the wall. She crouched down. There, among the broken frames and shattered glass, she found one photograph still mostly intact. The frame was cracked. The glass was gone, but the photograph itself, her grandmother on opening day, young and serious and certain, was still whole. She picked it up with both hands. She held it. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not there. Not with the smell of them still in the room. She stood up slowly. She looked at what had been done to the place her grandmother built and the place she had spent 6 years protecting. And she felt something shift inside her. Not collapse, not defeat, something colder, something quieter, something that had been there all along under the surface that she had spent years deliberately carefully on purpose, trying not to use. She looked at the phone in her apron pocket. She looked at the photograph in her hand. She thought about what her grandmother used to say about strength, about asking for help, about the difference between needing people and depending on them in ways that cost you who you are. She thought about her father. She hadn't called him in years. She had reasons for that. Good reasons. Complex, real reasons that had taken her a long time to work through and that she still even now did not fully regret. But she also had in her pocket a phone, and in her memory a number she had never deleted. She set the photograph down very carefully on the least damaged table she could find. She walked to the door. She looked out at the quiet mountain street, the morning light coming in sideways, the town going about its business with no idea what had just happened inside this building. She thought about Caleb Voss, about the smile, about nobody is coming to save you. She thought about every customer who had ever sat in this room. Earl in his black coffee, Dorothy in her chamomile tea that wasn't really a cafe drink, the teachers on Friday mornings, the miners stopping in before the early shift, the teenagers who came in after school and sat for hours over a single hot chocolate because they needed somewhere to be. She thought about what it would mean to lose this. Then she took the phone out of her pocket. She stood in the doorway of her broken cafe holding her phone, and she scrolled to a contact she had never deleted and never used. It said simply, Dad. Her thumb hovered. She had told herself years ago that she would never make this call, that she would build her life on her own terms in her own way, without the weight of who her father was following her into every room. She had been proud of that. She still was. But her grandmother's voice came back to her, clear as the day she'd first heard it. Strength is not pretending you don't need help. Strength is knowing when to ask for it. Madison looked at the broken cafe. She pressed call. It rang twice. Madison. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, careful, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago to say very little and mean all of it. She hadn't planned what she was going to say. She hadn't prepared anything. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not dramatic, was not a speech. It was just the truth in the simplest words she had. Dad, someone broke my cafe. A silence. Not a confused silence. The kind of silence that understands. Did they hurt you? No. Are you safe right now? Yes. Another silence. Shorter this time. Tell me what happened. So she told him. She stood in the doorway of her grandmother's broken cafe, and she told her father everything. She told him about Caleb Voss, about the visits, about the number he'd named, about her refusal, about what had happened this morning. She told it plainly without drama, the way she'd learned to tell things from him. She realized, though, she'd never admitted that before. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Jackson Walker said 4 words. We'll be there tomorrow. And Madison, who had not cried in front of 3 men, who destroyed everything her grandmother had built, who had stood in the wreckage of 43 photographs without shedding a single tear. Madison Walker stood in the doorway of her cafe and felt something in her chest crack open just slightly. Not collapse, not fall apart, just open, like a window, like something that had been sealed for a very long time and finally let in some air. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She took a breath. Okay, she said. Okay, Dad. She hung up the phone. She stood there for another moment, alone in the mountain morning. Then she turned back into her broken cafe. bent down, picked up a piece of broken ceramic, the letter C from her grandmother's handwriting. The word coffee shattered but not entirely lost, and she set it on the counter. She found a broom, she started sweeping, because the cafe was still hers, and it was still standing, and tomorrow was coming, whether she was ready or not. And somewhere on a road she hadn't traveled in years, her father was already picking up a phone. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table in the small house, 2 blocks from the cafe, the house she'd rented since she moved to Ridgecrest at 22, the house with the porch light that always needed a new bulb, and the kitchen window that looked out toward the mountains. And she sat with a cup of tea she'd made but hadn't drunk, and she thought about all of it. She thought about this call, whether she'd done the right thing, whether she'd undone 6 years of something she'd built carefully and on purpose. She had wanted so much to be a person who stood on her own, who was known in Ridgecrest as Madison Walker, owner of Golden Willow Cafe, granddaughter of Ruth Walker, not as Jackson Walker's daughter. Not as someone who carried that name and what it meant in the complicated, powerful, difficult world that came attached to it. She had come to Ridgecrest partly to build something of her own, and she had. She knew she had. 6 years of evidence said she had, but she was sitting here at 2 in the morning thinking about the coffee machine, thinking about the photographs, thinking about the ceramic letters, thinking about Caleb Voss and his measuring smile and the casual, practiced confidence of a man who had done this before and expected it to work because it always had. She thought about Frank at the hardware store, about the other business owners who paid, who kept paying, who had swallowed whatever they needed to swallow and kept going because the alternative was what had happened to her cafe today. She thought about what it would mean to be the person who changed that, not through her father, not through anyone who came after a phone call, through what that phone call made possible. She understood the difference. It mattered to her that she understood the difference. She was not calling in power to do her fighting for her. She was calling in the one thing Caleb Voss had been counting on her not having. Backup, not muscle, not intimidation, not a threat to match his threat. Backup, people, numbers. The kind of presence that makes other people feel brave enough to say what they already know. She understood this the way she understood her grandmother's coffee recipe, not because anyone had taught it to her in words, but because she had grown up in proximity to it and absorbed it through years of watching. The tea had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. At 7:15, the next morning she opened the cafe. The coffee machine was broken. She had a small French press she used at home, and she brought it in and she made coffee in it, batch by batch, and she set out the cups the way she always did. Earl Hutchins came in at his usual time. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the damage, the bare wall where the photographs had been, the repaired as best she could counter the conspicuous absence of the old machine. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he walked to his table, sat down, and said quietly, "Black, please," same as always. And Madison, who understood everything contained in those 4 words, brought him his coffee. Dorothy Vance came in. The teachers came in. Other customers she hadn't expected came in, people who had heard something, who weren't sure what, but who showed up anyway because that's what you do in a small town when one of your places is hurting. Nobody asked questions she didn't want to answer. Nobody offered advice she hadn't asked for. They came, they ordered, they sat, they stayed a little longer than usual. The cafe was broken and still full. Madison stood behind the counter and felt something she hadn't expected to feel that morning. Grateful. Just past noon she heard it. It started as a sound at the edge of hearing, low rhythmic building. The kind of sound that you feel in your chest before you fully process it with your ears. Engines, motorcycle engines, not 1 or 2, many. Earl looked up from his paper. Dorothy set down her tea. Everyone in the cafe went still. Madison walked to the front window and looked out at the street, and she saw them coming. Dozens, then more than dozens, a line of motorcycles stretching back further than she could see, moving in perfect formation down the main street of Ridgecrest, Colorado, unhurried and deliberate and entirely, completely certain of their right to be exactly where they were. The sound filled the mountain air. It filled the town. It filled the cafe. Madison pressed one hand flat against the window glass. She hadn't told anyone what she'd done. She hadn't told anyone who was coming. She had swept up broken ceramic and opened for business and served coffee from a French press and not said a single word. Now she watched the motorcycles come and she thought about her father's voice on the phone. "We'll be there tomorrow." He had meant today. He had meant right now. He had meant this. The motorcycles began pulling to the curb outside. They filled the street in front of the cafe, then spilled down the block in both directions. They came to rest one by one, and the engines cut off, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the sound had been. They didn't get off their bikes immediately. They sat for a moment in the way that people sit when they want to make sure a room understands the weight of their arrival. Then they began to dismount, quietly, orderly, without aggression, without display. They stood on the sidewalk outside her broken cafe, and they waited. Madison watched from the window. Her hand was still pressed against the glass. She felt Earl at her shoulder. He had gotten up from his table quietly and come to stand beside her. He looked out at the street. He looked for a long time. Then he said very simply, "Huh." And Madison, who had been holding herself together for 36 hours with nothing but stubbornness and her grandmother's voice in her head, felt the corner of her mouth lift just slightly into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was its closest cousin. "Yeah," she said. Outside among the riders, she saw a man she recognized by his posture before she could see his face. The way he stood still, unhurried, taking up space without performing it. Her father, Jackson Walker. She hadn't seen him in 4 years. She pressed her hand harder against the glass. Then she dropped it, straightened her apron, took a breath. She walked to the door, reached up, touched the copper bell her grandmother had hung in 1987, just briefly, just for a second. Then she opened the door and walked outside to meet him. Behind her, the cafe was broken and full and still standing. Ahead of her, the mountain street held more motorcycles than Ridgecrest had ever seen in one place. And somewhere in the distance, though she couldn't have known it yet, though nobody in town could have known it yet, Caleb Voss was standing at his office window, looking down, for the first time since she had known his name, not smiling. Jackson Walker was not a tall man. That was the first thing people always got wrong about him when they heard his name and built a picture in their heads. They expected someone physically imposing, someone who looked like the authority he carried. But Jackson stood at average height, average build, with gray coming in, heavy at his temples now, and hands that were rough from decades of work. What he had, the thing that made people step back without knowing why they were stepping back, was stillness. He was the most still person Madison had ever known. In any room, in any situation, he was the one who wasn't moving, wasn't reacting, wasn't giving anything away. It had made him a difficult father to read when she was growing up. It made him, she had come to understand as an adult, a very dangerous person to underestimate. I was standing on the sidewalk outside her cafe, and when she came through the door, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, like he was taking inventory, checking the list, confirming that everything was still where it was supposed to be. She stopped a few feet from him. The distance felt both too close and too far. "You look tired," he said. "I haven't slept much," she said. "No." He looked past her at the cafe window, at the bare wall visible through the glass where the photographs used to be. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes went very quiet and very focused, the way a flame goes still when there's no wind. "Show me," he said. She brought him inside. He walked through the cafe slowly. He didn't touch anything. He looked at the broken machine, the repaired counter, the empty wall. He stood in front of that wall for a long time, and she stood beside him and let him look, and she didn't say anything because she had grown up understanding that some things you don't fill with words. "How many photographs?" he asked. 43 of mine, 11 of Grandma Ruth's." He nodded, once, like he was filing it. "The machine? Yes. It was here before I was. I don't even know how old it is. Grandma Ruth bought it secondhand. I've been keeping it running for 6 years. He turned from the wall and looked at her. "Did he threaten you personally, face to face?" He implied. He was careful. He didn't say anything you could record and use. Of course he didn't. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but the shadow of it, the outline of it. Men like this are always careful about that part. Earl Hutchins, who had been quietly sitting at his table through all of this, pretending very hard to read a newspaper, he had not turned a page of in 20 minutes, looked up. He looked at Jackson. Then he looked at Madison. "Friend of yours?" Earl asked carefully. "My father," Madison said. Earl looked at Jackson Walker for a long moment, the way old men in small mountain towns look at things they are recalculating. Then he said Earl Hutchins and extended his hand. Jackson shook it. Jackson Walker. Earl nodded slowly. Been coming here 6 years, Earl said, since the day she opened. He looked back at the empty wall, at the empty space where the photographs had been. Those were good photographs, he said quietly, like a eulogy. They'll be back, Madison said. She said it before she knew she was going to say it, and when it came out, she realized she meant it. Not as hope, as fact. Every single one. Jackson watched her say it, and she caught for just a moment something in his face she hadn't seen in years. Something that looked almost like the expression parents get when they see their children become the person they always suspected they could be. He looked away before she could be sure. Walk me through what you know about this man, he said. Everything, from the beginning. So she did. They sat at Earl's table. Earl stayed because Madison didn't ask him to leave, and he didn't offer to go, and honestly, his presence was a comfort she wasn't going to refuse, and Madison told her father everything she knew about Caleb Voss. The businesses, the payments, the names of the owners she knew had been paying him, the pattern of what happened to the ones who resisted, the 2 visits, the number he'd named, the way he'd said her name the second time, like he already owned a piece of her. Jackson listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't write anything down. He just listened with that absolute stillness that meant he was storing everything, cataloging everything, letting nothing go. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how many business owners are paying him? I know of at least 6. There are probably more. Have any of them talked to the police? Frank at the hardware store tried, about 8 months ago. He said the officer he spoke to seemed sympathetic, but that within a week his suppliers started having problems with his deliveries. He stopped after that. Jackson absorbed this. So someone in local law enforcement, either on Voss's payroll or afraid enough to cooperate with him. That's what it looks like. Yes. He nodded, quiet for another moment. Then, you said no to him twice. Yes. And you knew what would happen. I had a pretty good idea. He looked at her steadily. Why? She looked back at him. She thought about how to answer, and then she decided not to manage it, not to shape it, just to say the truth. Because if I said yes once, it was over. Not the cafe me, everything I've been trying to build here. Grandma Ruth didn't build this place by paying men like him to leave her alone. She built it by being something they couldn't buy. I wasn't going to be the one who sold it. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Your grandmother would have said the exact same thing, he said, in almost exactly those words. Something tightened in Madison's throat. She didn't let it become anything. I know, she said. Outside through the window, the motorcycles were still lining the street. Riders had started moving not away, just shifting, settling the way people settle in when they understand they are going to be somewhere for a while. A few of them had positioned themselves at the entrance to the small alley beside the cafe, just present, not threatening, not displaying, present. A man named Cruz came in through the front door. He was one of her father's. She could see it in the way he moved, in the way he and Jackson exchanged a look that carried 3 sentences worth of information in about a quarter of a second. He leaned down and said something quietly into Jackson's ear. Jackson's expression didn't change. All right, he said just as quietly. Cruz left. What? Madison said. Voss knows we're here. Jackson looked at her. He has people watching. He would have seen us arrive. Good, she said before she could stop herself. Something crossed her father's face that might, under different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. You've gotten harder, he said. It wasn't a criticism. It sounded, if anything, like a compliment. 6 years in the mountains will do that, she said. Dorothy Vance had been listening to all of this from 2 tables over, with the careful, refined attention of a woman who had been raised not to eavesdrop and had been doing it expertly for 73 years. When Madison looked at her, Dorothy met her eyes without embarrassment. For what it's worth, Dorothy said primly, I saw one of those men. When they came, I saw his face. She paused. I remember faces. Madison looked at her. Dorothy? I'm not a young woman, Dorothy said with a dignity that could have filled a courtroom, but I am a witness, and I have been sitting quietly in this cafe for 6 years, watching a young woman do exactly what her grandmother would have wanted. I would like to do the same if someone will tell me how to be useful. Earl set his newspaper down. I know which officer Voss is connected to, he said simply like he was giving a coffee order. Saw them together twice in a context that didn't make sense unless there was money involved. I did to myself because I'm an old man and I didn't think it mattered. He looked at Madison. I was wrong about that. I'd like to correct it. Madison looked at her father. Her father looked at the table, then at Earl, then at Dorothy, then back at Madison. All right, Jackson said. He pulled out a phone, sent a brief text to someone. I know a federal investigator, not local, someone Voss wouldn't have been able to reach. He looked up. If you're willing to make a formal statement. Earl nodded. Past due, he said. Dorothy straightened her back in a way that suggested she had been ready to do this for considerably longer than she was willing to admit. Tell me where to sign, she said, and something shifted in the room. Something subtle and enormous at the same time. Madison felt it the way a temperature change feels before you can name it as warmth or cold before you've calibrated to it. She felt the room change. This was how it started, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with anyone doing anything that looked from the outside like a turning point. It started with an old retired miner and a 73-year-old woman who drank chamomile tea saying quietly out loud for the first time, I know something. I saw something. I'm ready to say so. It started with people deciding in the same room at the same time that they were done being quiet. She went behind the counter and started a new batch of coffee in the French press. Because if people were going to be here, they were going to have coffee. That was what the cafe was for. The morning stretched into afternoon, and the afternoon did something Madison had not expected. It got busy. Not with customers, or not only with customers. With people. With a version of the town that Caleb Voss had been systematically preventing from existing people. Talking to each other in groups at tables pushed together. Voices low but not silent, the specific energy of a community that has been holding something back and has finally collectively decided to let it forward. Frank from the hardware store came in. He sat across from Jackson Walker and he talked for 40 minutes and he left with a card in his wallet that had a phone number on it and the words federal investigator on it in her father's handwriting. A woman named Sasha, who ran the dry cleaning business on 4th Street, came in with her daughter. She ordered 2 coffees and then said, almost in a single breath, like she'd been building up to it for months. I've been photographing the payment receipts every week for 14 months. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with them, but I have them. The silence that followed that sentence was the specific silence of people recognizing that someone else has been as afraid as they have been and has done something brave anyway, alone without knowing if it would matter. Madison reached across the counter and put her hand over Sasha's. It matters, she said. It matters a lot. Jackson made a call. The federal investigator's name was a woman, which Sasha seemed to find unexpectedly reassuring. She took the number. She put it in her phone immediately, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she waited. The daughter, who was maybe 19, sat through all of this with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her eyes very wide and bright. When Sasha stood to leave, the daughter looked at Madison and said, "Is it going to work?" Madison looked at her. At this young woman, maybe a decade younger than her, sitting in her grandmother's broken cafe on a day that could have gone entirely differently. I don't know, Madison said, but more people know the truth right now than knew it this morning. That's real. That doesn't go backward. The girl nodded slowly, like she was keeping it. Then there was the moment that changed the shape of the entire afternoon. It was around 2 o'clock. The cafe had cycled through 3 waves of people. Jackson was on his second coffee. She had gotten the French press working as efficiently as it could, which was to say not very, but enough. And Cruz had come back in twice with information that he and Jackson processed in quick, quiet exchanges that Madison stayed close enough to overhear. She was behind the counter when the door opened and a man she did not recognize came in. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing clothes that were too casual to be accidental, the specific kind of casual that people adopt when they want to seem like they're not what they are. He looked around the cafe and he looked at the riders positioned near the door, and something in his face did a quick recalculation. He saw Jackson. Jackson saw him. A pause, very brief, like 2 chess players recognizing the board has changed. The man said with a careful neutrality that was itself a kind of message, "I heard there was some trouble here." "There was," Jackson said. "There doesn't need to be any more. I'm just here to—" The man stopped, started again. "Mr. Voss wanted me to let you know that he's available to discuss any misunderstanding." There's no misunderstanding, Madison said from behind the counter. Her voice came out flat. She hadn't planned to speak, but she wasn't sorry she had. The man looked at her, then back at Jackson. He was doing visible math, calculating something about where he was standing and what it meant, and whether the number came out the way he'd expected before he walked through the door. It clearly hadn't. Tell Mr. Voss, Jackson said quietly, standing up from his stool. And the stillness of him, the absolute absence of performance in his voice, was somehow more arresting than if he'd shouted that we're not here to negotiate, we're here because someone tried to take something that didn't belong to them. And now the people who know about it are talking to the right people. He can get ahead of that, or he can wait for it to catch up to him. The man's jaw worked slightly. He was trying to find the right response, and he couldn't because there wasn't one. The conversation was already over. He left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Earl Hutchins picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and said to no one in particular, "Should have come in here for coffee years ago. Better show than the television." The tension broke not dramatically, not all at once, but in pieces, a sound from one table, a released breath from another. And then Madison heard herself make a short, genuine sound that might have been a laugh. And then it was almost okay, almost normal, almost like a regular afternoon in the cafe. Almost. Because normal was relative now, and relative to the last 48 hours, this room full of people talking, this line of motorcycles outside, this accumulating, gathering, snowballing sense that the silence was ending was something better than normal. This was something new. Her father found her in the back around 3 o'clock. She was doing dishes. There was always dishes in her experience. The universe expressed its opinion of crises primarily through the accumulation of dirty cups. And he came and stood in the doorway, the way he used to stand in the doorway of her bedroom when she was a kid, and he was checking on her without wanting to admit he was checking on her. "You need anything?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said. Then, because she was trying to be honest, "I'm tired. I'm scared. I'm also," she paused, searching for the word, "I'm also angry. And the anger is useful right now, so." He nodded. "Dad." She turned from the sink, looked at him. "How many people out there?" "As of an hour ago, 237 riders," she stared. 200. "Word travels," he said with a simplicity that didn't quite conceal what it meant, that this many people had responded to a single phone call inside 24 hours. She turned this over in her mind. 237 people who had gotten on motorcycles and driven to a mountain town in Colorado because a woman they had never met needed someone to stand beside her. Because her father had asked. Because that was the kind of man her Chauta was, and the kind of community he was part of, and the kind of thing that she had spent years trying not to need, and was only now standing in her broken cafe kitchen with soapy water on her hands, beginning to understand the full weight of. "You knew they'd come," she said. "I hoped," he said, which was from Jackson Walker, a very different thing than new. "Are they safe being here, I mean? Is there any risk for them legally?" "We're parking motorcycles on a public street," he said. "Last I checked, that's still legal in Colorado." "You know what I mean." "I know," he said, "and the answer is no. We're not here to threaten anyone. We're here to be visible. That's all. Visible and present and loud enough that this town can't pretend it didn't see us." She nodded, turned back to the sink, then said without turning around, "I'm sorry it took me this long to call." A pause. "You called when you needed to," he said. "That's enough. I could have." She stopped. "I spent so long trying not to be the kind of person who called, trying to prove I could do everything myself. And now I'm standing here thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't, if I just let him take it, or left, or given him what he wanted. I keep thinking about that." "That's a waste of thinking," Jackson said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "You didn't do those things. You did this instead. Start from there." She turned around, looked at her father, at the gray at his temples and the rough hands and the stillness and that she had grown up misreading as coldness, and had spent the last few years beginning to understand was something else entirely. "I start from here," she said. "Yeah, okay." He nodded. "Get some rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow's going to move fast." She already knew that. She could feel it the way you can feel weather changing, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of everything at once, the pressure shifting, the air going different. She could feel that the next day was going to be something she needed to be awake for. She went back to the dishes, and her father went back out to the cafe. And outside on the mountain street, 237 motorcycles waited in the late afternoon light. Tomorrow was already on its way. What she didn't know, couldn't know, standing in her grandmother's kitchen, rinsing coffee cups in a water that had gone slightly cold, was that Caleb Voss was not in fact watching from his office window in the calm, calculating way that men who think they are in control watch things. What she didn't know was that Caleb Voss had made 3 phone calls in the last hour, and none of them had been answered. What she didn't know was that the man he had sent to the cafe had come back and told him something quietly in his office that had caused Caleb to set down the glass he was holding and put both hands flat on his desk and stay very still for a long time. What she didn't know was that one of those unanswered calls had been to the officer whose cooperation he had been paying for since the beginning. And that officer, for the first time, had not picked up. The town was changing, the silence was ending, and Caleb Voss, for the first time in a long time, was the one who didn't know what came next. He was still dangerous. She would find that out, but he was no longer certain. And for a man who ran entirely on certainty, who needed people to be afraid, who needed the machinery of fear to keep working the way he'd built it, that uncertainty was the beginning of the end. It had started with an old woman's chamomile tea and a miner's black coffee and a photograph of Ruth Walker on opening day. It had started with a woman who refused to cry in front of the people who broke her grandmother's things. It had started with a phone call to a contact named Dad that Madison Walker had almost not made. Almost. The dishes were done. The cafe was quiet. 237 engines were waiting outside. And Madison Walker dried her hands, hung up the towel, and walked back into the room. She had a cafe to rebuild, and she was no longer doing it alone. The next morning came cold and clear. The way Colorado mornings do when they're trying to remind you that the mountains don't care about your problems. Madison was at the cafe by 4:30, same as always, except nothing was the same as always. There were 2 writers from her father's group already outside when she arrived, not blocking anything, not making a show of it, just present the way certain people are present when they've decided something matters. One of them nodded at her when she unlocked the door. She nodded back. She didn't ask their names. She understood they weren't there for conversation. She got the French press going. She set out the cups. She did the things she always did in the order she always did them because routine was the only scaffolding she had right now, and she was not going to let go of it. At 5:15, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, just he knows about the federal contact. Be careful today. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she forwarded it to her father. His response came in under a minute, already aware. Don't change anything. Open normal. She put the phone in her apron pocket. She started the second batch of coffee. Earl came in at his usual time, same as always, and sat in his window chair, and she brought him his black coffee without being asked, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And that silence was comfortable in the way only long familiarity makes silence comfortable. Then Earl said, without looking up from the table, "There's a truck parked at the end of the block. Been there since before I got here. Engine's off, but there's someone in it." Madison didn't look toward the window. "What kind of truck?" "Dark blue, late model. The kind of vehicle you buy when you want something with no personality." He picked up his coffee. "I may be old, but I'm not decorative." "Never thought you were Earl." "Good," he drank. "Your father know?" "I'll tell him." She sent another text. Jackson responded the same way, already aware. She almost smiled at that. By 7 o'clock, the cafe was fuller than it had been for a normal weekday morning in months. Word had moved through Ridgecrest, the way word moves through small towns, not on social media, not through any organized communication, but through the particular telephone of people talking to people who talk to other people. The original network, the one that's been running without interruption since human beings first lived in groups small enough to know each other's names. People had heard things. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew something was happening, and they came to the place where things were happening, which was what people in communities have always done when the moment requires witness. The teachers from the corner booth were back, but today they weren't laughing loud. They were sitting close together at their table, speaking low, and one of them, a woman named Claire who taught history at the high school and had a voice that carried whether she intended it to or not, said to Madison when she brought their order, "Is it true what people are saying about Voss?" "Depends what they're saying," Madison said. "That it's been going on for years, the payments, that it wasn't just you." Madison set down the coffee cups carefully. There are people who are ready to talk about what they know, she said, to the right people, people who can actually do something about it. Claire looked at her. And if we know things too, if some of us have seen things, been approached ourselves and stayed quiet because we didn't think there was a point. Madison looked at the table of teachers. 4 women, a combined century of living in this town, a combined whatever it was of knowing things and staying quiet because quiet felt safe. She looked at them and she thought about Dorothy Vance and her chamomile tea and her 73 years of careful attention. I have a number you should call, Madison said. She wrote it on the back of a receipt. She did it the same way she'd been doing it since yesterday afternoon. Every time someone sat at her tables and leaned forward slightly and said some version of "I know something" and then braced themselves for her to not believe them or not care or not know what to do with it. She always knew what to do with it. Jackson had prepared her for that the day before, the two of them sitting in the back after the cafe closed, going through it together. The investigator's name was Agent Renata Flores. She was based out of Denver Federal, specifically assigned to financial crimes and organized intimidation networks. Jackson had worked with her years ago in a situation he did not explain in detail, and Madison did not push on. What mattered was that Flores was real. Flores was outside Caleb Voss's reach, and Flores had, when Jackson called her, said 3 things. Yes, she was aware of Voss. Yes, she had been building a file. And yes, witnesses willing to make formal statements were the things she needed most. Every receipt with a phone number was a witness. Every person who leaned forward at Madison's tables was a crack in the wall Caleb had built around this town's silence. By 9 o'clock, Madison had handed out 11 receipts. By 10:30, she had handed out 23. That was when Caleb Voss made his second mistake. His first mistake had been underestimating what Madison would do when pushed. His second mistake was believing that because he knew about Agent Flores, he still controlled the situation. He sent a woman this time. That was new. She came in around 10:45, ordered a coffee. Madison suspected she didn't actually want, and sat at the counter with the specific body language of someone trying very hard to seem casual and failing at it in all the ways people fail when they learn casualness as a strategy rather than as a natural state. She was maybe 35, professional looking. She had the kind of face that was designed for reassurance, open, pleasant, warm, in a deliberate, manufactured way. She waited until there was a lull in the counter traffic, and then she said to Madison directly, "You're really brave, standing up the way you have." Madison looked at her. "Mr. Voss wanted me to tell you that he has a lot of respect for what you've built here." The woman continued. Her voice was very smooth. "He feels that there's been a significant misunderstanding. He genuinely liked the opportunity to make it right, privately, between the two of them. He thinks if you actually sat down and talked." "You can stop there," Madison said. The woman stopped. "I know what this is," Madison said. She kept her voice completely level because she had her grandmother's café to rebuild, and she was not going to spend her energy on anger toward the messenger. "You can go back and tell him that we're past private conversations. We are significantly past that." The woman's pleasant expression didn't break exactly, but it adjusted, recalculated. "He's prepared to compensate for the damage. The people who can help him now are lawyers," Madison said, "not me." A silence. Something shifted in the woman's eyes. Not anger, more like the look of a person who has just understood that the meeting they were sent to accomplish has already failed, and they now have to go back and report that. It wasn't a comfortable look to wear. She picked up her coffee. She left a 10 on the counter for a $3 drink. She walked out. Jackson had been sitting 2 tables over through the entire exchange. He hadn't moved or intervened. When the door closed, he looked at Madison with the same expression he'd had the night before, that thing that was almost a smile. "You didn't need me for that," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't." She picked up the $10 bill. She put it in the tip jar. She went back to work. But Cruz came through the door 15 minutes later, and this time the information he brought was not small. He bent down to Jackson's ear, and Madison watched her father's face do something she had never seen it do before. Not break, not alarm, but tighten. A tightening that was itself a kind of alarm for people who knew how to read him. Jackson stood up. He looked at Madison. "Come here." She came around the counter. He lowered his voice. Voss has filed a complaint with the county sheriff's office. He's claiming harassment. He's citing our presence on the street as an organized intimidation campaign against him. She stared. He's claiming he's the victim. It's a move, Jackson said without inflection. He's trying to get law enforcement to push us out before the federal investigation gets traction. If he can get the county to declare our presence a public disturbance, he creates legal grounds to make us leave. And if we leave, the people who are going to talk lose their nerve, Madison said. She heard the words as she said them, and she felt the specific sick clarity of understanding a trap after you've almost stepped in it. He's smarter than I gave him credit for, Jackson said. He said it without admiration, just acknowledgement. He knows the federal investigation is moving. He's trying to cut its legs off before it can stand. Can he do that? Get the county to move against you? He can try. Jackson looked at Cruz. Something passed between them. He's going to find it harder than he's expecting. Why? Because I made a call this morning, Jackson said. Before this came up, I made it because I had a feeling this was the direction he'd move, and I wanted to be ready. He looked at her. The county sheriff is a man named Dale Purcell. I have known Dale Purcell for 22 years. We don't agree on everything, but Dale Purcell is not on Caleb Voss's payroll, and he is not a man who likes being used. I spoke to him at 7 this morning. I told him who we were, why we were here, and what we were not here to do. He heard me out. And he said as long as we stayed legal, we stayed. Madison breathed. Okay, that's... But Jackson said, and the word landed with weight, Voss's complaint changes the math. Purcell is a fair man, but he's also a man who has to answer to people above him. If Voss pushes hard enough, if he has any political connections at the county level, Purcell might not have a choice. The room felt like it had contracted slightly. Earl, who had not moved from his table, who had been listening to all of this with the still, focused attention of a man who understood that he was inside a moment that mattered, said Dale Purcell's brother-in-law is a man named Greg Haskins. Greg Haskins owns the carpet supply store on Route 9. Caleb Voss has been collecting from him for 2.5 years. Everyone looked at Earl, looked back. I told you, I'm not decorative. Jackson looked at Earl Hutchins for a long moment. Then he said, would Greg Haskins talk? If someone sat down with him the right way, Earl picked up his coffee. Greg's a proud man who's been ashamed for 2.5 years. That's a combination that usually goes one of two ways. Stays silent forever or tells everything at once when someone gives him permission. He looked at Madison, the way she gave permission to that Sasha woman yesterday. Jackson was already reaching for his phone. But before he could make the call, the door opened, and the morning changed again. The man who came in was not someone Madison had seen before. He was young, late 20s, maybe 30, with the specific look of someone who had been awake too long and was running on something other than sleep. His eyes went around the room, quickly taking inventory, and when they landed on Jackson Walker, they stopped. I need to talk to you, he said to Jackson, not to Madison. Just you. Whatever you have to say, Jackson said, you can say in front of my daughter. The young man looked at Madison. He seemed to be making a decision. Then he made it. My name is Danny Reyes. I work for Caleb Voss. I do his bookkeeping. He stopped, swallowed. I have been doing his bookkeeping for 3 years, which means I know where every payment went, who it came from, how much, how often, and what account it ended up in. Another stop. His hands were not entirely steady. I've been thinking about walking out for over a year. I didn't know where to go. The silence in the cafe was absolute. Madison looked at Danny Reyes. She looked at the way he was holding himself, the posture of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and is just now in this room beginning to consider the possibility of putting it down. She pulled out a receipt. She wrote Agent Flora's number on it. She put it on the counter in front of him. That's a federal investigator, she said. Her name is Flores. She's been building a file. You'd be the thing that completes it. He looked at the receipt. He didn't pick it up immediately. Is it safe? He asked. He said it quietly, almost not to anyone, the way people ask questions they're not sure they deserve an answer to. I mean, can he... If you make a formal statement today, Jackson said, and his voice had that quality again, the quality of absolute certainty that lives somewhere below. Reassurance, something more structural than comfort. It becomes federal record. Voss can't touch a federal witness. His reach doesn't go that far. Danny looked at him. You sure about that? I've been sure about very few things longer, Jackson said. Danny Reyes picked up the receipt. He held it in both hands, looking at it like a man looking at something he understands is going to change the shape of the rest of his life. Then he said, I'll call her right now from here if that's okay. I'll get you a fresh coffee, Madison said. Her voice came out steady and warm and entirely certain. Take whatever time you need. He sat down. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. Madison went behind the counter. She started a new pot. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that, but she was. She heard him start talking quiet, careful, the first words of the kind of conversation that takes 3 years of courage to begin, and she turned away to give him privacy. And she pressed both palms flat against the counter for just a moment, for just a second. 23 receipts with a phone number. A bookkeeper with 3 years of records. A miner who wasn't decorative. A woman with chamomile tea and a perfect memory for faces. A hardware store owner who tried once and got burned and was ready to try again. A carpet supply store owner whose shame had been building for 2.5 years. And somewhere in Denver, a federal agent named Renata Flores, whose file was filling up by the hour. She thought about Caleb Voss in his office that morning, filing a complaint, trying to weaponize legality against the thing that was coming for him. She thought about the calculating smile and the way he'd said her name and nobody is coming to save you, and she thought with a clarity that felt almost like cold water, clean and sharp and real, that the man had never understood the first thing about the kind of town he'd chosen to operate in. He had looked at Ridgecrest and seen quiet. He had looked at these people, Earl and Dorothy and Frank and Sasha and Claire and Danny Reyes, who was on the phone right now telling a federal agent what he knew. And he had seen compliance. He had seen people who would bend because they had no other option. He had never understood that quiet is not the same as weak, that compliance is not the same as surrender, that people who are still showing up after everything, after the broken windows and the failed deliveries and the weekly payments that ate at something in them every single time, are not people who have given up. They are people who are waiting for the moment when standing up has a real chance of meaning something. She had given them that moment, or rather, and she knew this. She was honest enough with herself to know it. She had been given the chance to give them that moment by calling a phone number she had almost not called. The bell above the door rang. She looked up. A woman came in mid-40s, someone Madison had seen around town but didn't know by name. She stood just inside the door looking around at the room, at Earl, at the teachers, at Danny on his phone, at Jackson Walker with his coffee, and her expression was the expression of someone who has made a decision on the walkover and is still holding on to it with both hands. I heard this was the place, the woman said. If you had something you wanted to say about Caleb Voss. You heard right, Madison said. Come in. I'll get you a coffee. The woman sat down. Madison wrote another receipt. The morning moved fast and the pile of receipts grew, and Danny Reyes finished his call and then looked up at Madison with the specific expression of a man who has just done the most frightening and most necessary thing of his adult life and is not yet sure how he feels about it, except that he feels lighter than he did 30 minutes ago. She's sending someone today, he said, to take a formal statement, from me and anyone else who's ready. Heller, we might need more than one day, Madison said, and then the door opened again. This time it was not a customer, and it was not a messenger, and it was not someone who had decided to be brave. This time it was one of her father's riders, a man named Torres, who had been stationed outside since dawn, and he came in fast enough that Earl looked up, and Dorothy, who had arrived at her usual time and was on her second chamomile of the morning, put down her cup. Torres went directly to Jackson. He said 4 words very quietly. Jackson stood up immediately. His face had gone into that controlled stillness again. The extreme version, the one that meant something had happened that he had been planning for but had hoped wouldn't arrive yet. What? Madison said. Her father looked at her. He had the look of a man deciding how much to say and settling on all of it. Voss's lawyers filed a court injunction 20 minutes ago. They were asking a judge to declare our presence an unlawful assembly. They are claiming we're an organized criminal enterprise, tempting to interfere with a legitimate businessman. Madison heard this. She absorbed it. She let the full shape of it settle. Can they get it? She said. They got a hearing, Jackson said, this afternoon, 3 o'clock. On what grounds? That I have a prior criminal record, Jackson said. which I do 20 years ago, fully served, and that our organization has historically been associated with criminal activity, which legally speaking creates enough ambiguity that a sympathetic judge might grant a temporary injunction. And if they do, then we leave the street, Jackson said. And if we leave the street, Voss walks back into this town like nothing happened, Madison finished. Her voice was flat. And every person who was going to talk suddenly doesn't. The room was very quiet. Danny Reyes, who had been listening, said, "He's done this before. In the last town he operated in, before Ridgecrest, there was a group of people starting to organize against him, and he found a legal angle and he buried it. I know because I saw the paperwork. I saw what it cost." Everyone looked at him. He had gone slightly pale, but his voice was steady. He's good at this part. Finding the lever, finding the thing that makes people back down. Madison looked at her father looked at her, and then something moved in her, not panic, not fear, not the cold clarity of the last 2 days. Something different, something sharper and more specific. The anger she'd told her father about the day before, the kind that was useful, that pointed somewhere. "What time did you say the hearing is?" she said. 3 o'clock. "And Agent Flores, when is she sending someone for statements?" "She said this afternoon," Danny said. "She didn't give a specific time." Madison thought for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Call her back. Tell her we need someone here by noon. Tell her we have a bookkeeper with 3 years of financial records and 20 witnesses who are ready to make formal statements today, and that there is a court hearing at 3 o'clock that will determine whether those witnesses still feel safe enough to follow through." She looked at her father. "And you call Sheriff Purcell. You tell him the same thing. Tell him what Voss is doing and what it will cost this town if it works." Jackson looked at her for a moment. "You understand that even if we do all of that, it might not be enough." "Yes, I know." She looked at him steadily. "But we do it anyway, because the alternative is letting him win the same way he always wins, which is by making people feel like there's no point in trying." She picked up a fresh receipt, picked up a pen. "And I am not doing that. Not in my grandmother's cafe." The silence held for one more second. Then Jackson Walker picked up his phone. And Danny Reyes picked up his. And Madison walked out from behind the counter and went to the table where Dorothy Vance was sitting with her chamomile tea and her 73 years of careful attention. "Dorothy," she said, "I need your help." Dorothy Vance set down her cup. She straightened her back. She looked at Madison with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to be asked something that mattered. "Tell me what you need," she said. Outside, the motorcycles were still there. The dark blue truck at the end of the block was gone. And somewhere downtown, in an office where the furniture was expensive and the confidence had recently gone threadbare, Caleb Voss was looking at paperwork that he believed was his last best move. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. He would. 3 o'clock was coming. And Madison Walker, who had swept broken ceramic off her grandmother's floor 2 days ago, in a cafe that was supposed to have been destroyed, was not going to spend the next 4 hours doing nothing. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That was the thing about her that Caleb Voss had never understood and was about to learn in the most complete and permanent way possible. She did not stop. Not ever. Not when it was hard. Not when it was frightening. Not when the math didn't add up yet and the outcome wasn't certain. And the only thing she had was the next thing in front of her and the hands to do it with. She was Ruth Walker's granddaughter, and Ruth Walker's granddaughter did not stop. Agent Renata Flores arrived at 11:47. Madison knew it was her before anyone introduced her because she walked through the door of Golden Willow Cafe with the specific energy of a person who has been waiting for a room like this one for longer than anyone in it understood. She was compact, dark-haired, somewhere in her early 40s, and she moved the way people move when they have learned to read rooms quickly and have been doing it long enough that it no longer requires effort. She looked at the cafe, the French press on the counter, the people at the tables. Jackson Walker standing near the back, Danny Reyes with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he had refilled 3 times, and she looked at Madison behind the counter, and she said simply, "You're the granddaughter." "I'm the owner," Madison said. Something in Flores' expression shifted just slightly in a way that felt like respect. "Right," she said. "You're the owner." She set her bag on the counter. "I need somewhere private to take statements. A back room, an office, anywhere that isn't open floor." "Kitchen," Madison said. "It's not pretty, but it's quiet." "Kitchen works." Flores looked around the room. At Dorothy, at Earl, at the teachers, at the woman from mid-morning, whose name Madison had learned was Patricia, who ran a small alteration shop on Fifth Street and had been paying Voss for 19 months. At Danny Reyes, who looked up when Flores's eyes landed on him and held her gaze with the steadiness of someone who has already made his decision and is done being afraid of it. "Who's first?" Flores said. Danny stood up. "Me," he said. "I have documents." He reached into the bag he'd been carrying since he walked in that morning. Madison hadn't asked about it, had noticed it, had understood it was significant, and he pulled out a manila folder thick enough that it made a sound when he set it on the counter. Then another. Then a third. Flores looked at the folders. She looked at Danny. 3 years, he said. Every transaction, every name, every account number. I kept copies, off-site. He didn't know. A pause. I've been keeping them for 14 months. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew I needed them to exist somewhere he couldn't reach. Flores picked up the top folder. She opened it. She looked at the first page for about 4 seconds. Then she closed it carefully and said to Danny, "Kitchen, now, please." They went. The door swung closed behind them. The cafe was quiet for a moment. Then Earl said to no one in particular, "That boy's been carrying those folders around for 14 months. "Yes," Madison said. "That's a long time to be alone with something like that." "Yes," she said again. "It is." The morning rearranged itself around the rhythm of the kitchen door opening and closing as Flores worked through witness after witness with a methodical, focused speed that made Madison understand why her father had trusted this particular person. Flores did not linger. She did not over-explain. She asked precise questions, recorded precise answers, moved to the next person with the efficiency of someone who understands that time is the resource she has least of, and evidence is the resource she has most need of. She was in the kitchen with Danny for 22 minutes. She was with Dorothy for 14. Dorothy, who remembered faces and dates and the exact words people used in conversations they thought no one was paying close attention to. She was with Earl for 18. With Frank, who arrived at 10 past 12 with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets and his jaw set for 25. Each time someone came out of the kitchen, they looked slightly different than when they went in. Not relieved exactly, relief came later. Madison suspected when the full weight of what they'd done had time to settle. What they looked like coming out of the kitchen was lighter. The specific lightness of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for too long and has finally given it to someone whose job it is to carry it. Madison stayed behind the counter and kept the coffee going and did not go into the kitchen because her statement could wait. Because right now her job was to make sure the cafe stayed functional, stayed open, stayed the thing. It had always been the place where people came when they needed somewhere to be. Jackson came and stood at the counter at 12:30. 14 formal statements, he said quietly. As of right now. How many does Flores need? She said after Danny's documents, she needs enough corroboration to make the pattern undeniable. She said, he paused. She said the documents alone might be enough, but witnesses make it a certainty instead of a probability. Then we keep going, Madison said. He nodded. Then after a moment, the hearing is in 2.5 hours. She knew. She had been watching the clock with the specific discipline of someone who needs not to watch the clock, who needs to focus on what's directly in front of her, or she'll lose her footing in the rushing current of the day. What's the status with Purcell, she said. He called back an hour ago. He's aware of the injunction filing. He said he's going to be at the courthouse this afternoon. Jackson looked at her. He's not going as Voss's ally, but he's also not going as ours. He's going as the county sheriff, which means he's going to listen to what the judge decides and enforce it. That's fair, Madison said. That's all we can ask. It might not be enough, Madison. I know. She looked at him. But Flores is in that kitchen right now with 14 sworn statements in 3 folders of financial records. That's not nothing. That's not a bluff. Whatever Voss's lawyers argue at 3 o'clock, that evidence exists. It's federal record. It doesn't disappear even if the judge grants the injunction. Jackson was quiet for a moment. You've thought this through. I've had 3 days, she said, and not enough sleep. My thinking gets very clear when I haven't slept enough. His expression did the thing again, the almost smile. You get that from your grandmother, he said. She turned back to the coffee. But she felt it, what he'd said, in the place she kept things that mattered. It was 12:55 when the second messenger arrived. This one didn't pretend. He was one of Voss's people. She recognized him as one of the men from the first visit, the large, quiet ones who stood at the sides and said nothing. He stood in the doorway and looked around the room and found Jackson Walker and said, addressing him directly and entirely ignoring Madison. "Mr. Voss wants to speak with you, privately, before the hearing." Jackson looked at him. "No." "He's prepared to." "No," Jackson said again. The word had the same weight both times. Complete. Finished. The man looked at Madison then as if he just remembered she was the one who actually owned the place. "He wants to talk to you. He said to tell you he'll walk away. He'll leave Ridgecrest. No hearing, no lawyers, no more trouble. He just wants this done quietly." Madison set down the French press. She looked at this man, this person who had been in her grandmother's café the morning. Everything was broken, who had stood near the wall when the photographs came down, who had been there and had said nothing and done nothing while it happened. And she felt the anger again, the cold, clear, useful kind, and she let it be there. And then she said, "Tell him it's too late for quiet. The people in this town have been quiet for years. They're done. And so am I." The man looked at her for a moment. Whatever he was reading in her face, it was apparently enough. He left. Dorothy Vance said from her table, "Good girl." She said it the same way she said everything, with perfect posture and complete certainty. But at 1:15, something happened that nobody had planned for, and it hit the room like a sudden change in air pressure, the kind that makes your ears pop and your stomach drop before you understand what's caused it. Flores came out of the kitchen. She came out faster than she'd come out after any of the previous witnesses, and her face had the controlled, focused expression of someone managing something significant very carefully. She went directly to Jackson, and she said something to him in a voice too low for Madison to hear. And Jackson's face went through a change that she had never seen on him before. Not the stillness, not the almost smile, but something that moved quickly across his features, like a wave over water, and was gone before she could fully read it. "What?" Madison said from behind the counter. Flores looked at her, made a decision, walked over. "Greg Haskins," she said, "the carpet supply store. He called the direct number Jackson gave me 40 minutes ago. He's been in his car outside for the last half hour. He couldn't make himself come in." She paused. "He's ready to talk, but that's not the thing." "What's the thing?" Madison said. "He says he has audio recordings, 6 of them, conversations between himself and Voss about the payments. He recorded them on his phone over the course of 8 months because—" She paused again, and Madison heard in that pause the weight of a man's particular kind of shame and particular kind of preparation. Because his brother-in-law is the county sheriff, and he knew that if he was ever going to be believed, he needed something that couldn't be argued with. The silence was total. Greg Haskins had been recording Caleb Voss for 8 months, while paying him, while being ashamed of paying him, while his brother-in-law, Dale Purcell, enforced the law. One county over, and couldn't know, couldn't be told, because knowing would put him in an impossible position. Greg Haskins had been carrying audio recordings of a man confessing to extortion for 8 months because he needed to be believed, and he didn't know yet that there would be a day when someone would be there to believe him. Madison pressed her hands flat on the counter. "Get him inside," she said, "please." Flores went to the door. She opened it and leaned out and said something to someone outside, and a minute later a man in his early 50s came in, stocky, red-faced from cold or emotion or both, with the body language of someone who has been sitting in a car working up to something for 30 minutes and has finally run out of time to keep working. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at Madison. He said, "You're Ruth Walker's granddaughter." "Yes," she said. "She was a good woman," he said. "She made the best apple pie I ever had." "She did," Madison said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Come sit down, Mr. Haskins. I'll get you a coffee." He sat. He put his phone on the table. His hands were shaking visibly the way hands shake when the body has been under sustained pressure and has finally been given permission to show it. "I need you to know," he said to the room in general, to Madison specifically, "that I'm not a coward. I want someone to know that. I was afraid and I made bad choices because I was afraid, but I'm not." He stopped. "I have a wife, 2 kids. I didn't know what he would do. I didn't know how far it went." "I know," Madison said. She put a cup of coffee in front of him. "Everyone in this room understands that." Earl from his window table said, Greg, I've known you 15 years. Nobody here thinks less of you for being human. Greg Haskins looked at Earl. Something in his face cracked open just slightly in the way faces crack open when someone says the thing you needed to hear and didn't let yourself expect. He picked up his coffee with both hands. He drank. He set it down. Let's do this, he said. Flores took him to the kitchen. The door swung shut. At 1:45, Jackson got a text. He read it, and he read it again, and then he looked up at Madison with an expression she had never once seen on her father's face in her entire life. He looked stunned, not alarmed, not afraid, stunned in the specific way of someone who has been in enough difficult situations to have learned not to expect good surprises, who has calibrated for the bad and made peace with the uncertain, and who is now standing in the presence of something that landed far better than the math suggested it should. Tell me, Madison said. Dale Purcell, Jackson said. He just called me. He looked at his phone, back at her. He found out about the audio recordings on. Haskins called him 20 minutes ago. He called his brother-in-law and told him everything. The recordings, the payments, all of it. He paused. Dale Purcell is withdrawing his neutrality. He's going to the courthouse this afternoon, not as an observer, as the county sheriff filing a formal statement of support for the federal investigation. The room went very quiet. Then Dorothy Vance said with the serenity of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the moment when the tide turns, well, that changes things rather significantly. It did. Everything that happened next happened fast in the way things that have been building slowly sometimes collapse into speed all at once, the way water gets to the edge of a dam and then simply isn't stopped anymore. Flores came out of the kitchen at 2:10 with Greg Haskins' recordings transferred and logged as federal evidence. She made 2 phone calls in rapid succession, standing at the counter with her coffee going cold beside her. The second call Madison gathered from the half she could hear was to a federal judge. She used words like audio evidence and corroborated financial records and 22 sworn statements and county law enforcement cooperation, and her voice had the particular tone of someone laying out a hand they know is unbeatable and taking no pleasure in it, just doing the job. When she hung up, she looked at Madison and said, Voss's injunction hearing is going to go differently than he planned. How differently? Madison said. The federal investigation is now formally open. It was informally open. Before we had a file, we had interest. We had the beginning of something. As of 12 minutes ago, it's a formal federal case. His lawyers can argue whatever they want at 3 o'clock. They're arguing in front of a judge who is about to receive a notification that their client is the subject of a federal investigation for extortion, financial fraud, and organized criminal intimidation. She picked up her coffee, drank it cold. Whatever the county judge decides about the injunction, it doesn't matter anymore. You can't close a federal case with a county court order. Madison absorbed this. He's going to know, she said. Voss, he's going to find out before 3 o'clock that this has shifted. Probably, Flores said. His lawyers will know within the hour. What does he do then? Madison said. What do men like him do when the exit closes? Flores looked at her with the level gaze of someone who has answered this question in professional context many times. One of 3 things, she said. They run, which is difficult when a federal case is open because your accounts get flagged. They lawyer up and go quiet, which is the smart move. Or they make one more play, something aggressive, something that costs more than it's worth because they're not thinking clearly anymore. She paused. In my experience, men who have operated in small towns where fear kept everything running, men who have never actually been seriously challenged before they tend toward the third option more often than you'd expect. The room held that. Earl set his coffee cup down very carefully. Madison looked at her father. Her father was already looking at her. The café, he said, not a question. A realization spoken out loud, the 2 of them arriving at it at the same moment from the same place. He knows it's over, Madison said. The case is open. The witnesses have talked. Haskins' recordings exist in federal evidence. Even if he runs, even if he goes quiet, it's done. But if he's the kind of man who needs the last word, he might try to take something with him, Jackson said. He was already moving toward the door, already reaching for his phone, already in the specific mode of operation that Madison recognized from years of watching him, the mode that meant he had assessed the situation and was acting, not planning, acting right now. He spoke to Torres first, then 2 other riders, then Cruz, She couldn't hear all of it, but she heard, "Don't leave the building, front and back, everyone visible right now." "Should we close?" Madison said. "No," Jackson said, without hesitating. Closing is what he wants. Closing is him winning the last small thing. You stay open. You stay exactly where you are. She looked at the cafe, at Earl, who had not moved from his table in what had to be 6 hours and showed no intention of starting. At Dorothy, who had refilled her chamomile for the third time and was sitting with her hands folded and her back straight, with the posture of a woman who intends to be exactly where she is for as long as necessary. At Danny Recios, who had made a phone call that took 3 years of courage, who had nowhere to go and didn't seem to want anywhere to go, who was sitting in a booth in the back with an expression of someone discovering with some surprise that the thing they were most afraid of turned out to be the thing that felt most like solid ground. At Patricia from the alteration shop, who had stayed after her statement, who had ordered 2 more coffees and a piece of the coffee cake that Madison had put out because people needed to eat. At the teachers, who had cleared their student papers and replaced them with laptops and were doing what teachers do in a crisis, which is stay and bear witness and make sure someone writes it down. This was her cafe. These were her people. Caleb Voss had looked at all of this, at this room, at these faces, at the 6 years of ordinary, irreplaceable community-built life that Ruth Walker had started and Madison had continued, and he had seen nothing worth respecting. He had seen a target. He had seen a woman who could be broken. At 2:45, Madison's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. "You think you won." Caleb Voss's voice on the phone was different from his in-person voice. The smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and harder and colder. "You think this is over." She walked to the back of the cafe away from the tables because this was her conversation and she was going to have it on her own terms. "I think the federal investigation is open and 22 people have made sworn statements, and there are 6 audio recordings of you committing extortion in evidence right now," she said. "I think that's what I think." A pause. "You've caused a lot of damage." "You caused the damage," she said. "I just made sure it got documented. I could still—" "No," she said. "You couldn't, not anymore, and you know that. That's why you're calling me instead of your lawyers." A pause of her own. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever last play you think you have, I need you to hear me. There are 237 people outside my cafe who will be witnesses to whatever happens next. There is a federal agent inside my cafe. There is a county sheriff on his way to a courthouse to file a statement on behalf of this investigation." She kept her voice completely level. The anger was there underneath, but she didn't need it right now. Right now, she needed something colder and cleaner than anger. "You have one move left. You know what it is. Make it." A long silence. "You're not afraid of me," he said. He said it with a strange quality, not quite disbelief, more like someone encountering a fact they had repeatedly told themselves could not be true and are now being forced to update. "I was afraid of you," she said. "The first time you walked into my cafe, I was afraid. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't." She looked at the wall where her grandmother's photographs used to hang. "But you made a mistake. You broke things that mattered to people. And people who have lost something that mattered to them are a lot harder to scare than people who are just worried they might." Another silence, longer this time. Then the call ended. No goodbye, just the click of disconnection, the small sound of a man out of moves. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she walked back to the counter. "Well," Earl said. "It's done," she said. And then, because she wanted it to be true before she was sure it was true, she said it again. "It's done." At 3:22, Jackson's phone rang. He answered it. He listened for 90 seconds, said 3 words, and hung up. He looked at Madison. "The injunction was denied," he said. "The judge received the federal notification during the hearing. Voss's lawyers tried to argue, but the judge, and I'm told she was not particularly patient about it, told them that county court was not the appropriate venue for a matter under active federal investigation and adjourned." He paused. Voss was in the courthouse. He was there in person, which apparently his lawyers had advised against, but he insisted on. Another pause. He walked out without saying anything to anyone. "Where did he go?" Madison said. "That's the thing," Jackson said. "We don't know, but it doesn't matter. He's not going anywhere he can't be found. Flores has the case. The evidence is federal record. His lawyers know the position they're in." He looked at her steadily. "It's over, Madison. Not in the dramatic way, not a big scene with someone in handcuffs today. That part takes time. But the power he had in this town, the fear that kept people quiet, the mechanism of it, that's done. You can't rebuild that once 22 people have told the truth on record. She let this settle. She had understood intellectually that this was probably where it was going. But understanding something is coming and standing inside it when it arrives are different experiences. She looked at the cafe, at the bare wall, at the broken machine that someone had moved carefully to the side, at the French press and the stacks of cups and the coffee cake and the people who had been here all day, who had come and stayed and talked and told the truth. She thought about her grandmother, about Ruth Walker, young and serious-faced, and certain standing outside this building on the day it opened, with $6 and a recipe for apple pie and the stubbornness of a woman who believed that the most important thing you could do was give people somewhere to belong. She thought about what Ruth would think of today, of all of it. She thought she probably would have offered everyone more coffee and complained that the apple pie had run out. Dorothy Vance materialized at her elbow with the uncanny timing of a woman who has spent a lifetime knowing when people need to be interrupted from their own thoughts. "Madison," she said. "Yes, Dorothy. I would like to help rebuild the wall." She said it simply, no preamble, no context, just a statement, clear and direct and completely Dorothy. "The photographs. I want to help find the ones that were damaged and restore what can be restored and reprint what can't." She paused. "I have over the years taken a great many photographs in this cafe. I may have copies of some of your grandmother's." Madison looked at her. She felt something move through her from somewhere below her ribs. Something large and warm and too real to have a clean name. "You have photographs of Grandma Ruth's," she said. "Several," Dorothy said. "I've been coming here for 12 years. I photograph things I want to remember." She looked at the wall with the same expression she'd had it all day, attentive cataloging, missing nothing. "I believe I have a photograph of this wall, taken about 8 years ago when your grandmother was still alive. Every picture, every frame, I could print it. You could use it as a map." Madison pressed her fingers to her mouth. "Just for a moment. Just for a second." Then she lowered her hand. "Dorothy," she said, "I think you might be the most important person who ever walked through that door." Dorothy Vance looked at her with mild, dignified pleasure. "I've been coming here every Tuesday and Thursday for 12 years, she said. "I was hoping I'd find a use eventually." And Madison, who had not cried in front of the men who broke her grandmother's cafe, who had held herself together through 3 days of something that would have flattened most people who had chosen action over grief and kept choosing it, Madison laughed. Actually laughed from somewhere real, and the sound of it filled the cafe, the way that sound fills rooms where people have been serious for too long and needed the release. Earl looked up from his table with an expression of profound satisfaction. Danny Reyes smiled. Patricia from the alteration shop, who barely knew anyone in this room, smiled too, because some things are contagious across even short acquaintance. Jackson Walker stood near the door and watched his daughter laugh in her grandmother's cafe and did not try to hide what was on his face. He was proud of her. He had always been proud of her. He just hadn't said it often enough, in time enough before enough of the years had gotten between them. He thought that was something he might be able to change. Not today. Today was full. But starting from tomorrow, starting from the conversation they'd been circling since he walked through this door, the one that neither of them had gotten to yet, because there had been too much happening and because some conversations require the right kind of quiet. Tomorrow, they had time now. That was the thing Madison was realizing as the afternoon settled around her and the people in the cafe began to relax into something that felt almost like ordinary. They had time now. The thing that had been eating the future, the presence of Caleb Voss, and what he represented and what he could still do was no longer standing between her and the next thing. She had a cafe to rebuild. She had photographs to put back on the wall. She had a coffee machine to find. She had been doing research quietly between everything, and there was a man in Denver who restored vintage equipment, and she had his number, and she was going to call him tomorrow. She had a relationship with her father that had been frozen in a particular moment for 4 years and was now perhaps something different, something that could move forward. She had work to do. She always had work to do. She went back behind the counter. She picked up the French press. She looked around the room at the people in it. "Anybody need a refill?" she said. Everybody did. She went around the room and filled their cups one by one, The way her grandmother had the way she had for 6 years, the way she intended to keep doing for as long as her hands worked. And the mountain stood, and the copper bell above the door kept ringing when someone needed somewhere to be. The afternoon light came through the windows. Outside, the motorcycles were still there. But not because anyone was afraid. Because community, when it shows up, doesn't rush to leave. The morning after the hearing, Ridgecrest woke up different. Not loudly different, not the kind of different that announces itself. The kind of different that you feel in the quality of the air before you've had enough coffee to name it, a loosening, a release of something that had been held tight for so long that people had stopped noticing the tension until it wasn't there anymore. Madison noticed it at 4:30 when she unlocked the cafe door, and the town outside felt different to her than it had felt 3 mornings ago, when she had unlocked the same door with the same key and walked into the same building that had subsequently been destroyed. The mountains were the same. The street was the same. But something in the texture of it had shifted the way rooms shift after windows are open for the first time in winter. Same room, same walls, different air. She started the French press. She set out the cups. She stood behind her counter in her broken cafe, and she let herself feel for the first time since Tuesday morning something that was not urgency, not fear, not the cold, useful anger. Something quieter and more complicated that lived under all of those things and had been waiting patiently for them to clear. She felt grief, real, honest, uncomplicated grief, for the photographs on the floor and the coffee machine that had made a sound she would hear in her sleep, and the ceramic letters in her grandmother's handwriting that had shattered into pieces she was still finding in the corners. She let herself feel it because her grandmother had taught her that grief was not weakness, it was measurement. It told you exactly how much something had mattered. And then she let it move through her and out the way her grandmother had also taught her, because grief that you hold on to becomes weight you carry forever. And Madison Walker had work to do. Earl came in at his usual time. He sat at his window table. She brought his coffee without being asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You sleep." "Some," she said. "Enough." He nodded. He picked up his cup. "Greg Haskins called me last night. He wanted to know if I thought he'd done the right thing." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought he'd done the only thing," Earl said, "and that there's a difference." He drank his coffee, set the cup down. He cried, not a little either. 14 months of it seemed like. He looked at her. "I told him that was probably overdue too." Madison sat down across from Earl Hutchins for the first time in 6 years of him sitting at this table. She had always stayed behind the counter, always kept the distance of the server from the served, because she believed in that boundary, believed it protected something. But this morning she sat down across from this man she had made coffee for 2,000 times, and she looked at him, and she said, "How are you, Earl? Not about any of this. How are you?" He looked a little startled. Then something in his face softened in a way she had never quite seen before, the way old men soften when they're asked about themselves by someone who means it. "I'm all right," he said. "Better today than yesterday." He looked out the window. "I've been coming to this cafe since your grandmother opened it. I watched her build it from nothing. I watched her make it into something. And then I watched you come here at 22 years old and take it on, and I thought," he stopped. "I thought this is going to be hard for her, because it's always hard for the one who comes second, the one who inherits instead of starts. People compare. People remember different. People forget that carrying something forward takes as much courage as beginning it." He looked back at her. "I was wrong to stay quiet. When Voss started, I knew things and I stayed quiet, and I told myself it wasn't my place, and I've been sitting with that." "Earl," she said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quickly. "I'm just saying it out loud. It felt like it needed to be said out loud." She looked at him. "You came back every morning," she said, "even when things were hard, even when you could have gone somewhere else. You sat in that chair and you drank your coffee, and you made this place real by being in it. That mattered. That always mattered." She paused. "The other thing, you said it when it counted. That's what counts." He looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more than agreement. Then he went back to his coffee, and she went back behind her counter, and the morning started. Her father arrived at 8. He had been staying in town, a motel 2 blocks over. She'd found out through Cruz, not from Jackson himself, because Jackson Walker was constitutionally incapable of mentioning his own accommodations as if they mattered. He came in the front door and sat at the counter, and she put a coffee in front of him without asking, because she had learned over these last 3 days that some things about her father she had always known, without fully knowing she knew them. Flores called this morning, he said, early. Good early or bad early. There's no such thing as a bad early in a federal investigation, he said. Early means they're moving. He wrapped his hands around the cup. She confirmed the case is formally filed. The financial records Danny provided are being processed. The audio recordings have been authenticated. She said, he paused. She said she's seen cases built on less that took years to get to where this one started. Madison absorbed that. What happens to Voss? He hasn't left town yet, which is interesting. Jackson looked at his coffee. His lawyers advised him to stay. Probably worried that leaving looks like flight. His accounts are flagged. Flores moved on that yesterday afternoon. He's not going anywhere. That costs money, and everything this man does costs money. He paused. She said to expect an arrest within the week, possibly sooner. Madison thought about Caleb Voss waking up this morning in his expensive house with his expensive things and the full unambiguous understanding that the machinery he'd built to run his life had stopped working, that the people he'd counted on to stay afraid had stopped being afraid, that the silence he'd maintained by force was full of sound, now permanent sound, the kind that lived in federal record and didn't go quiet. Good, she said, simply, just that. Her father looked at her. You're not angry now that it's real. She thought about it honestly. I was angry, she said. I used the anger because I needed it, but I'm not going to be angry at him forever. I don't have the space for it. She looked at the empty wall. I have other things to do with my space. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then your grandmother used to say something like that. I know, she said. I got it from her. They drank coffee together in a silence that was different from the silences they'd had in the last 3 days. Those silences had been operational, full of the compressed information of people working together under pressure. This silence was older. It had history in it. It had 4 years of not calling and the complicated reasons for not calling and the question of what came after, the reasons after you'd lived with them long enough to understand them fully and had to decide what to do next. She decided to be the one to begin it. I'm sorry I cut you off, she said. I had reasons. They were real reasons, but I also, she stopped. Tried again. I think I was afraid that if I kept contact with you, I would never stop being defined by you, by what your life is, by what people assume about you. She looked at him directly. And I needed to be Madison Walker cafe owner, not Jackson Walker's daughter. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He just listened the way he always listened, completely. You don't have to explain, he said when she was done. I know, she said. I wanted to. There's a difference. He nodded, a long pause. Then, I should have made it easier for you to be both things at once. To be your own person and also someone with a father who, he stopped. Something moved across his face briefly. I wasn't always around in the way you needed. When you were younger, I knew it then. I know it better now. He looked at his cup. I don't have a version of that I can make clean. I just know it. I know you know it, she said. That's not the same as saying it. No, she agreed, it isn't. Another silence. But this one was different, again lighter, the way rooms feel after windows have been open long enough that you forget what the air was like before. Come for breakfast, she said. Not just coffee, actual food. Sit at the counter. Let me cook for you. She looked at him. I'm a good cook. You don't know that because you've never let me feed you properly. He looked at her with an expression that she thought she would keep for a long time, surprised and trying to not look surprised and failing, because this was apparently the one request he hadn't expected, and it had gotten through the stillness in a way that the crisis and the confrontation in the last 3 days of difficulty had not. All right, he said. Yeah, okay. She went to the kitchen and she made him breakfast. Eggs the way she made them, the way she developed the recipe over 6 years of cooking for other people with the small additions and adjustments that turned a simple thing into something you remembered. Toast from the sourdough she baked herself twice a week before opening. Coffee, of course, from the French press because the machine was still broken and would be for a while yet. She brought it out and set it in front of him and stood back. He ate in silence for a moment. Then he said without looking up, "This is really good." "I know," she said. He looked up at that. And this time the almost smile became an actual one, brief and real, and the most unguarded she had seen on his face in as long as she could remember, maybe ever. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly off balance since long before Caleb Voss ever walked through her door. The morning filled up after that, the way mornings at Golden Willow Cafe were supposed to fill up with the ordinary, beautiful, irreplaceable noise of people who belong somewhere, showing up because they belong there. Dorothy came in at 8:15 and ordered her chamomile tea, and then before sitting down, placed a manila envelope on the counter. Madison opened it. Inside were 18 printed photographs. The wall, every frame, 8 years ago captured in the precision of a woman who photographed things she wanted to remember. Madison held the photographs and looked at them, each one carefully. She recognized every frame. She could name every person in every image. She looked at her grandmother, young and serious, and certain in the original photograph, the one she'd carried in her hands through the destruction of everything else, the one that was currently sitting on the counter in its cracked frame, waiting for a new piece of glass. She looked at Dorothy Vance, who was settling into her chair and arranging her things with the methodical precision of a woman at home in her space. "Dorothy," she said. Dorothy looked up. "Thank you," Madison said. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But sometimes the inadequacy of words is itself part of the meaning. 12 years of Tuesday and Thursday, Dorothy said. This place has given me far more than 18 photographs. Don't thank me. Just put them back up. I will, Madison said. Every single one. The first twist of the morning came at 9:45, and it came in the form of a vehicle Madison did not recognize, pulling up outside, not a motorcycle, not one of Voss's, not anyone she could immediately place. A van with out-of-town plates. Two people got out with equipment she recognized after a moment of confusion as camera equipment. News camera equipment. She felt her stomach tighten. One of the people, a woman in her 30s with a press badge clipped to her jacket, came through the door and looked around and found Madison immediately. "I'm looking for the owner of Golden Willow Cafe," she said. "Madison Walker." "That's me," Madison said carefully. "I'm Jenna Carroll, Denver Post. We've been following the federal investigation story. One of our sources mentioned a woman in Ridgecrest who was at the center of it. Would you be willing to talk to us?" Madison looked at her. She looked at the camera equipment being set up near the door. She thought about what it would mean for her story to be told in a larger room than Ridgecrest, not for herself, but for Danny Reyes, who needed people to understand why he stayed for 3 years before he walked away for Sasha with her 14 months of photographs for Greg Haskins, who had been ashamed for so long he'd started to mistake the shame for who he was. She thought about what her grandmother would do. Ruth Walker had never once been afraid of being done. "Put the camera over there," Madison said, pointing to the corner away from the tables where customers were eating. "And I'm not stopping service for this. If I need to make someone a coffee while we're talking, I'm making them a coffee." Jenna Carroll looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and something in her expression said she had found exactly what she came for. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Madison talked while she worked, pulling shots from the French press, cutting coffee cake, nodding at customers who came in and managing them with the practiced ease of someone who has been running a room for 6 years. She talked about her grandmother. She talked about what the cafe was and what it meant, and why she had said no the first time and the second time, and why she would have kept saying no. She talked about the people who'd stayed quiet and why they'd stayed quiet, and why she understood it and didn't blame any of them. She talked about calling her father, about what it had cost her to make that call and what it would have cost her not to. She did not perform any of it. She just told the truth straight the way she'd been telling it all week, and the truth had the quality it always had. When it was complete and unmanaged, it landed with a weight that needed no decoration. At one point, Jenna Carroll asked, "Were you afraid he would come back after the hearing, after the case was filed?" Madison was filling Earl's coffee when she answered. "I'm always a little afraid," she said. "That doesn't go away. But I realized something about fear this week." She set the pot down. "Fear doesn't mean stop. Fear means pay attention. I paid attention. I'm still paying attention. And I'm still here." Earl, who had not been introduced to the camera or asked to be on it, said from his table, "She makes good coffee, too. Put that in the article." Jenna Carroll laughed. Madison laughed. Even the cameraman, who had been professional and invisible in the corner, made a sound. At 11:30, Madison's phone rang. It was Flores. "They picked him up," Flores said. "No preamble, no softening. Just the fact, clean and direct. 20 minutes ago, his lawyers were with him. He didn't resist. Madison set the phone flat on the counter for a moment. She pressed both palms down on either side of it. She breathed. "Are you there?" Flores said. She picked it back up. "I'm here, Baishu. Formal charges are being filed this afternoon. Extortion, financial fraud, organized criminal intimidation." The audio recordings alone would have been enough. With the financial records and the 22 sworn statements. Flores paused. "He's not going to walk away from this, Madison." "Okay," Madison said. "You understand what that means." "Yes," she said. "It means it's over." "It means it's over," Flores confirmed. "The legal process takes time. There'll be hearings, a trial, all of it. But the mechanism, the fear of the payments, what he built here, that's gone. Today." "Thank you," Madison said, "for coming when we called, for moving fast." "Thank you for giving me something to move with," Flores said. "Those witnesses were—" She paused, and Madison heard in that pause the professional control of a woman who does not usually let cases become personal, and was managing the fact that this one had slightly gotten away from her in that regard. "They were something," Flores said. "Tell them they did good." Madison hung up. She stood behind her counter. She looked at the room. Earl was looking at her. Dorothy was looking at her. Danny Reyes, who had come back in at 9 that morning because apparently he had nowhere else he particularly wanted to be, and the cafe had started to feel like somewhere was looking at her from the booth in the back. The teachers were looking. Patricia was looking. Jenna Carroll's camera was unfortunately looking. "They arrested him," Madison said. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Earl Hutchins set down his coffee cup with a firmness that was its own kind of statement and said, "Good." Dorothy made a sound, small, contained, dignified, that was nonetheless unmistakably the sound of a woman who has wanted something very much for a long time and has just been told she gets it. Danny Reyes put his head down on his folded arms on the table, and his shoulders moved, and Madison could not see his face, and she did not try to, because some things are private even in public rooms. Jackson came around the counter, which he had not done before, and he stood beside his daughter, and he put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way parents touch their children when words are both necessary and impossible at the same time. She covered his hand with hers, just for a moment. Then she straightened up. She had a cafe to rebuild. She started that afternoon. The writers began it, which was not something she'd asked for, and was something she was only slightly prepared for emotionally. Cruz came to her at 2 o'clock with a look on his face that she could only describe as slightly sheepish for a man who did not typically traffic in sheepish, and he said, "Some of the guys want to help with the repairs, if that's okay with you." She looked at him. "They don't have to." "No," he said. "They don't." He looked at the wall at the machine at the counter with its careful amateur repairs. "But they'd like to." She thought about her grandmother, about the $6 in the second-hand coffee machine, and the apple pie recipe and the community that Ruth had built so carefully one ordinary morning at a time. She thought about what it meant to let people in, not just in the door, all the way in. "Tell them yes," she said. "Tell them thank you." What happened next was the kind of thing that small towns tell stories about for decades. It was not dramatic in the traditional sense. Nobody made a speech. Nobody organized it into something photogenic. It was just people working. 2 of the writers were electricians in their civilian lives, and they got into the walls and fixed the things that Voss's men had damaged when they'd broken the machine's power connection. Another one, a quiet man named Becker, who barely said 10 words the entire time he was there, turned out to have spent 20 years restoring antique furniture, and he looked at the broken chairs and tables like he was being reunited with old friends. Frank, from the hardware store, showed up at 3 with supplies he would not let Madison pay for, and he and 2 of the writers worked on the counter until the repairs that she had done with amateur hands and exhaustion were replaced by something solid and clean. Sasha from the dry cleaner brought food, an enormous quantity of it, more than enough for everyone working, which turned out to be more people than anyone had planned for because word kept spreading and people kept arriving with tools or food or simply the desire to put their hands on something and make it better. Dorothy Vance sat at her table and directed the wall restoration with the authority of a woman who had 18 photographs and a perfect memory and was not going to let anyone hang anything crooked. 2 inches left, she would say from her chair. "No, the other left. Stop. That's it. That's exactly it." The man holding the frame, one of the writers, Someone twice Dorothy's size and probably 4 times her weight would adjust accordingly and wait for her verdict with the focused attention of someone who has correctly identified where the authority in a room lives. Perfect, Dorothy would say. And then next one. Madison worked alongside all of it. She cooked, she made coffee, she handed people things and accepted things and said thank you so many times the phrase started to lose its shape in her mouth, and she meant it every single time, which she supposed was the important part. Around 5 o'clock, she found herself standing near the back watching the room, and it hit her the full unguarded weight of it in a way that it hadn't been hitting her because she'd been too busy to let it land. This was what her grandmother had built, not the tables or the chairs or the photographs or even the coffee machine. These people in this room who had chosen without being asked to show up and put their hands on something broken and make it whole. This was the thing Ruth Walker had understood and spent 40 years creating the conditions for a community that knew how to take care of itself because it had been given somewhere to practice. The cafe had done that. The ordinary, unremarkable, 6 days a week fact of the cafe had done that. Every morning that Earl had sat at his window table and Madison had brought him his coffee without being asked every Tuesday and Thursday, that Dorothy had come in for her chamomile tea every Friday, that the teachers had filled the corner booth, all of it. Every small, unrepeatable, ordinary moment had been building this. A community that knew each other well enough to move together when it mattered. Caleb Voss had looked at all of this and seen nothing worth respecting. He had been wrong about that in a way so fundamental that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. She didn't, though. Not quite. Her father found her near the back. He had been working too. She'd seen him moving through the room, talking to people, lifting things, being useful in the practical, unshowy way that was apparently the Walker family method of participation. He came and stood beside her and looked at the room with her. Your grandmother would have opinions about the placement of that photograph on the left, he said. Madison looked. The photograph in question was Ruth's original opening day image, restored to its central position on the wall, the cracked frame replaced with a new one that Becker had made from reclaimed wood that was somehow exactly right in a way she couldn't have specified in advance. The frame would have bothered her, Madison agreed. She would have said it was too new. She would have been wrong, Jackson said, but she would have said it. Yes, Madison said, she would have. They stood together, side by side in the cafe that Ruth Walker had started, and Madison Walker had continued, and they looked at what the people around them were doing, and neither of them said anything for a little while because some things don't need to be filled. Then Jackson said quietly, I'm going to come back. Not to stay, but to visit, if that works for you. She looked at him. You don't have to ask, she said. You're my father. I wanted to ask, he said. There's a difference. She smiled at him. A real one. The kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that means something. Come back, she said. Come for breakfast. I'll cook for you. I'll hold you to that, he said. Good, she said. You should. The evening arrived and the work continued into it, and at some point Madison turned on the lights. The new ones, the ones she had not yet had time to be sentimental about because they were so new, and the cafe looked in that light like itself again. Not identical to what it had been. Slightly different. The new frame on the old photograph. The repaired counter that was slightly different in grain from the original. Small changes that marked what had happened, that bore evidence of the damage and the healing equally, the way a well-healed scar is not an absence of injury but a record of survival. She thought that was probably right. She thought she didn't want it to look like nothing had happened. What had happened mattered. The evidence of it mattered. The coffee machine was the last thing. She had been in contact with the restorer in Denver. His name was Paul, and he had a shop full of machines that other people had given up on. And when she described Ruth's machine over the phone, he had made a sound like recognition, like someone hearing the description of an old friend. He was coming on Saturday. He had told her not to promise anything, but that machines built the way they used to build them were often more repairable than people expected. She was choosing to believe him. She set the French press back in its temporary position of honor behind the counter. She looked at the space beside it where the old machine would go when it came back. She would wait. She had learned in the last week that some things were worth waiting for. At 8 o'clock, with most of the work done and the room settling into the quiet warmth of people who have worked together and are now enjoying the companionable tiredness of it, Danny Reyes came and stood at the counter. He had been here all day, He had worked, eaten, drifted in and out of conversations with people he didn't know 3 days ago. He looked different than he had when he walked through the door Tuesday morning, with his folders and his shaking hands and his 3 years of weight. Still tired, still carrying something, but lighter, structurally lighter. I don't know what I'm doing next, he said. I quit this morning, obviously. I don't have another job. I don't have... He stopped. I just wanted you to know that I know what it cost you to make this place what it is. And I know that what happened this week shouldn't have had to happen, and I'm sorry that it did. She looked at him. You gave us what we needed to finish it, she said. Those folders, that call to Flores. That was you. You created the conditions, he said. Danny, she said his name firmly, kindly. Take the win. You earned it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. A small, real, unpracticed nod. Do you know how to wait tables, she said. He blinked. What? Wait tables. Take orders. Carry food. Basic cafe work. She looked at him steadily. Because I've been running this place by myself for 6 years, and I could use another set of hands, and I figure I know your character better than I'd know most people I'd hire, which is usually the hard part. He stared at her. You're offering me a job. I'm asking if you know how to carry a plate without dropping it, she said. We can call it whatever you want after that. I was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, surprise, calculation. Something that was clearly not the response he had prepared for, because it was clearly a response he had never considered was possible. I can learn, he said, to carry plates. Good enough, she said. She put a coffee cup in front of him. Start tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at her. He picked up the cup. 7 o'clock, he said. And that was that. The last person to leave that night was Earl Hutchins. Everyone else had gone, the riders filing out in the gentle way they'd been doing everything, Dorothy escorted home by one of the teachers who lived near her. Frank with his leftover supplies. Sasha with her empty containers. All the people who had come and worked and eaten and made the day into the thing it had been. Earl put on his jacket slowly, the way old men put on jackets when their joints have been sitting for a long time and need diplomatic handling. He picked up his hat. He looked around the cafe at the photographs on the wall. All of them, the wall complete again. Dorothy's map followed to the inch. At the new counter, at the lights. He looked at Madison. Your grandmother, he said, would be very proud of you. She felt it land in her chest. She felt it all the way down. I know, she said. And then I hope so. Not hope, Earl said. No, I knew Ruth Walker for 40 years. I know what she would say. He put his hat on. She would say you did exactly right, and then she would complain about the frame on the photograph and offer you a piece of pie, and the pie would be the real compliment. He walked to the door. He put his hand on it. See you tomorrow, Madison. Same time as always, Earl. He nodded. He pushed through the door. The copper bell rang her grandmother's bell. 1987, still working, still true. And then he was gone, and the cafe was quiet, and Madison was alone in it. She stood behind the counter. She looked at the room, at all of it. The photographs, the repaired chairs, the new counter, the French press standing in for the machine that was coming back on Saturday, the lights her grandmother hadn't chosen, and she had the copper bell that Ruth had chosen, and she was keeping until it fell apart of its own accord, which she suspected might be never. She thought about the week. She held it all at once, the bell above the door, and the 3 men in the broken photographs, in the ceramic letters, in the night she sat at the kitchen table with cold tea and her grandmother's voice in her head, and the phone call she had almost not made, and the sound of 237 engines coming down the mountain road, and her father's face when she opened the door, and Danny's folders on the counter, and Dorothy's 18 photographs, and Greg Haskins in his car for 30 minutes, gathering himself, and Flores's voice saying they picked him up, and Earl's coffee cup set down with finality, and her father's hand on her shoulder, and the new frame on the old photograph, and Danny Reyes saying 7 o'clock. She held all of it, and she felt underneath it all the thing that had been there the whole time. Quiet and structural and load-bearing, the thing that had kept her moving through every moment when stopping would have been easier, her grandmother's certainty. Ruth Walker's bone-deep, unshakable belief that if you built something real and you held on to it and you let people into it, it would hold. Not because the world was fair, not because bad things didn't happen, but because people given the chance, given somewhere to stand, will stand there. They will show up. They will choose the thing that costs them something over the thing that costs them nothing. Because the thing that costs them nothing turns out to be worth nothing. And people, real people, ordinary people, scared people understand this somewhere below the level of language. Caleb Voss had never understood it. He had looked at Ruth Walker's cafe and seen nothing worth protecting because he had no reference point for the thing it actually was. He had looked at Madison Walker and seen a woman alone, a target, something that could be broken. He had brought 3 men and a calculation and the infrastructure of fear that he had built over years of practice, and he had lost. Not to power, not to force, not to the motorcycles on the street, or the riders at the door, or even to the federal case that was going to take his freedom. He had lost to a woman who refused to cry in front of him. He had lost to an old miner who noticed a truck with no personality parked at the end of the block. He had lost to a woman who drank chamomile tea and remembered faces. He had lost to a bookkeeper who kept copies of everything for 14 months because he needed someday to be believed. He had lost to a hardware store owner who tried once and tried again. He had lost to a carpet supplier who recorded 6 conversations on a phone in his jacket pocket because his brother-in-law was the sheriff and he needed something that couldn't be argued with. He had lost to an entire town that had been waiting silently for the moment when standing up had a real chance. He had lost to a copper bell and a second-hand coffee machine and 43 photographs of ordinary life on a wall in a mountain cafe in Colorado. He had thought he was destroying a small business. He had awakened something that was never going to go back to sleep. Madison Walker turned off the counter light. She untied her apron. She folded it the way her grandmother had always folded it, the same way Ruth had folded it in this kitchen for 40 years before her, precise and habitual and full of the quiet dignity of someone who believes that how you put things away at the end of the day says something about how you'll pick them up again tomorrow. She hung it on the hook behind the counter. She looked at the cafe one last time. Then she walked to the door, put her hand on the handle and looked back at the photographs, at the repaired walls, at the French press, waiting for morning at the space beside it where the machine was coming back on Saturday, because some things that look broken are just waiting for the right hands. She thought about tomorrow, about Earl at his window table at the same time he'd always been there, about Dorothy and her chamomile tea, about Danny at 7 o'clock, probably nervous, probably early carrying plates he was learning not to drop, about her father who had said he'd come back, who meant it, who she believed, about the copper bell when the first customer came through the door, about the smell of coffee in the mountain morning air, about all the ordinary, irreplaceable, load-bearing days ahead of her, the days that were made of nothing more or less than people showing up for each other in a place that had been built to make that possible. She pushed through the door. The copper bell rang. Golden Willow Cafe was still standing. It always had been. And now rebuilt by the hands of the community it had spent 40 years building, it was never going to fall.